The chair across from him let out a soft creak as the woman stood up, and her words cracked through the air like an icy slap in the middle of a winter night. "You are not the kind of man I am looking for." No apology, no hesitation. She pulled on her coat and walked away, leaving Michael Grant frozen in place inside the small diner by the Minnesota lakeside, where strings of Christmas lights trembled with every gust of wind against the glass. In that moment, the cheerful chatter around him seemed to fade, replaced by the crushing sensation that someone had just collapsed the whole room into his chest. Michael lowered his head, his fingers brushing the phone that still displayed a photo of his daughter Emma, grinning under a little reindeer hat. And just like that, the date had ended faster than the food could reach the table. He heard his own sigh, a sound tangled with disappointment, embarrassment, and the biting cold of a man who had tried one more time, only to be rejected one more time. Michael stood ready to leave before anyone noticed his humiliation. But then a voice, calm, clear, unfamiliar, sliced into the quiet from the table beside him, sharp like metal catching the light. "Would you like to become my new husband?" Michael's world stilled. Every sound in the room stretched slowed, as if the air itself was holding its breath. He turned his head so slowly he could hear the faint rustle of his coat. The woman sat alone by the window, Christmas lights casting a cold, sculpted glow on her face. Her grey eyes did not waver. No teasing, no drunken holiday joke. Grace Whitford. One glance, and he knew she was the kind of woman people looked at twice just to confirm she was real elegant, assured wrapped in a dark brown wool coat tailored perfectly to her frame, a steel watch glinting beneath the lights, the aura of someone used to making impossible decisions without asking permission. But beneath all that strength was something she could not hide, a quiet exhaustion, flickering like the last light of the day. Michael stammered, What did you say?" Grace did not blink. "I asked if you want to become my new husband." Two people at a nearby table turned. An older couple at the bar raised their brows, and as if fate had been waiting for its cue, the snow outside thickened, hitting the window and melting into fog that blurred the small lakeside street. Inside Michael, a storm twisted confusion, suspicion, a flash of anger at the thought that he was being mocked right after being hurt. But threaded through all of it was something he could not shake, the startling sincerity in Grace's voice. He looked at her again, and that was when he saw it clearly, the loneliness in her eyes, deep and heavy, like the winter lake outside. Why, he finally asked, his voice rough. Grace exhaled her breath, leaving a faint white trace above the untouched wine glass. "Because I know what just happened to you." Her hand tilted slightly toward the empty chair in front of him, still holding the fading warmth of the woman who had walked away. "And because I am tired of proving myself to people who judge me at a glance." Her voice did not tremble, but something in its tone squeezed at his chest. This was not a joke, not a pity. These were the words of someone too worn down to pretend anymore. Grace gently turned her wine-glass eyes, drifting toward the snow-covered window. "My family has pushed me to get married for 3 years. They parade a list of successful men in front of me, telling me to pick one and settle down. But none of them actually sees me. And She paused, letting the weight of her silence fill the space. "I just want a real family, a place to come home to." Her words struck Michael exactly where he was weakest. His hurt, his loneliness, he thought he hid so well. He tried to speak, but nothing came. Grace tilted her head. "You don't have to answer now," she said softly, her voice gentle as fresh snow on fingertips. "Just sit. Let me buy you the dinner you deserve." And that was when Michael realized something. This stranger did not just hear him. She saw him. Every rejection, every time he forced himself back up again, every year, he spent raising Emma alone in the house that still held traces of Laura, the wife he lost forever. He did not know how to explain it, only that her voice, her eyes, the painful honesty wrapped in quiet beauty, all of it made it impossible for him to walk out that door. Michael sat back down, and as the soft clinking of silverware floated through the air, as the smell of toasted bread drifted around the room, as the snow outside fell so thick it nearly erased the Christmas night sky, he understood he had just stepped into something strange, daring and dangerously unpredictable. A second chance, or another wound. But sometimes people have to reach into madness just to grasp what they lost long ago: hope. Michael Grant had never imagined he would sit across from a woman he had known for less than 5 minutes, only to hear words capable of turning his entire life upside down. Yet here he was, beneath the warm, golden glow of the lakeside diner lights, with the wind whipping against the windows and the faint scent of cinnamon drifting from Christmas pie. His hands trembling slightly as he looked into the cold but fathomless grey eyes of Grace Whitford. Everything inside him wanted to run and wanted to understand her at the same time, because there was something about this woman, something he could not name, but it made his heart stumble in its rhythm. Grace set her wine glass down, the soft click ringing in his head like the opening chime of a moment he could never step back from. "I know my question is insane," she said, her voice low, but not hoarse, shaped by countless sleepless nights. "But sometimes people only find what is right when they dare to do what no one else would." Michael let out a helpless laugh, not from amusement, but from bewilderment. "You just asked me to marry you right after I got dumped by a woman who did not even finish her coffee. Honestly, I have no idea what you are trying to do." Grace looked at him with a steadiness so firm he had to look away for a second. "I am not here to play games," she said. "I am not the kind of person who speaks without thinking." She turned the steel watch on her wrist, a small, habitual gesture that hinted at some old pain she rarely touched. "My family?" she began, her voice dropping. "For 3 years they have pushed me to get married. Thanksgiving dinners turn into matchmaking events. Christmas becomes negotiation. Everyone has an opinion about who I should choose. Businessmen, doctors, lawyers. But none of them care what I want. They just want me to fit the mold they made." Michael listened and heard something familiar in her tone, the exhaustion of someone who had held herself together for far too long. "And I," Grace continued, her fingers tracing the side of her glass. "I want a real family. Not a relationship built on advantage, not a marriage that feels like a transaction. I want the feeling of being chosen for who I am." Her eyes curved into a small, sad smile. "But the men I date do not want that. They want my company. They want my reputation. Some want a ladder to climb. Some want the shine of being associated with me." Michael frowned. "All of them were like that." Grace nodded slowly. "And when I told them I could not have children," the sentence hung in the quiet air. Michael held his breath. Grace pressed her lips together, trying to hold on to the composure she had spent years building. "The man I was once engaged to, Tom, ended the engagement the day after he found out. He said he wanted a real family, a child carrying his bloodline. So I was not the right choice. The final 4 words dropped like a shard of ice onto a frozen lake, so cold they made Michael shiver. He leaned back, his heart tightening. He knew that feeling, the feeling of being seen as not enough, of falling short of some invisible benchmark someone else invented. He had heard those lines for years. "I am not ready to be a stepmom. You have too much baggage. I want someone with more freedom." He looked at Grace, and in that moment he saw a terrifying symmetry. 2 very different people carrying the same wound, judged for what they lacked instead of what they were. But Grace was not finished. "When you talked about your daughter," she said, her gaze softening about her sticking drawings on the refrigerator, "about how you try to fill the emptiness for her, I understood how deeply you love your family. And when that woman rejected you, just because you have a child," I thought she drew a slow breath, steadying her voice. "I thought maybe God is playing some strange trick tonight." Michael let out a quiet laugh, not mocking but acknowledging that if that were true, the trick was indeed strange. Grace rested her elbow on the table, leaning slightly toward him. "You are a good father, Michael. I could hear it in every word you said about Emma. But those women did not see that. They saw a burden." And she touched the rim of her glass. Her voice, barely above a murmur. "I was rejected because I cannot have children. You were rejected because you have one. I was rejected because I do not." She lifted her eyes, and the look she gave him landed with force. What if those 2 wounds could fill each other? The question froze him. Part of him wanted to get up, leave escape from a conversation that exposed far too much and carried far too many risks. But another part, the part tired of loneliness, tired of carrying everything alone, wanted to believe this could be something. Grace Michael said quietly, "You do not know anything about me, except a few stories and the embarrassment you saw earlier." Grace smiled, barely the kind of smile that belonged to someone who understood more than she said. "I know the most important thing. You are someone who does not give up, even when life keeps knocking you down." She leaned in slightly. "And I know something else. You deserve to be loved without being judged." Michael felt his heart pound like a drum in the stillness of the room. No one had ever said that to him. No one had ever looked at him the way she was looking, not as a burden, not as a man chained to his past, not as someone failing at love, but as someone worth choosing. Grace extended her hand gently, as if making sure she would not startle him. "I am not asking you to marry me," she said. "I am only asking you to give me a chance to see if this crazy idea can become something good. For you. For your daughter. And maybe for me, too." Michael looked at her hand, slender but steady, the hand of someone who had built her life from pieces of brokenness. And he realized the scariest thing was not her proposal. It was the feeling that he wanted to believe her. Wanted to try. Wanted to step into something that could break him again, but could also save him. Outside, snow fell heavier, whitening the window completely. Inside, the warmth of the wine and the distant hum of Christmas music seemed to draw the 2 strangers closer. Michael swallowed, lifted his gaze to Grace, and for the first time in many years, he didn't feel alone. Michael Grant sat motionless across from Grace, but inside him, a storm was roaring, a storm he had held back for far too long. The words she had just spoken, calm, honest, strange enough to make a person want to believe them, had touched the deepest place within him, the place where he hid the pain no one wanted to hear, and no one ever truly understood. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, and like an old film strip blown open by the wind, an image of Laura, the woman he had loved with everything he had flickered into his mind. He remembered the way she laughed every time the first December snow fell, the smell of apple pie she always baked for him and Emma during the holidays, the sound of her voice whispering, "You are going to be an amazing father, Michael." Now all of it was only memory. Laura had left on a morning so cold, Michael swore the frozen lake felt warmer than her hand. Cancer did not warn, did not ask permission. It simply took everything. In the 6 years since that day, Michael had felt both like a lighthouse and like a castaway, guiding Emma forward, while having no idea where his own harbour was. He opened his eyes and looked at Grace. "You do not know anything about my life," he said, not harsh, only tired, the kind of exhaustion that had piled up over years. Grace did not react with offence or impatience. She only tilted her head, her gaze softening, as if she were used to people building walls to protect themselves. "Then tell me," she said. And for the first time in many years, Michael felt he could. He spoke not like a man trying to impress someone, but like a man who had kept his pain unsaid for so long it had begun to rot inside him. He spoke about Laura, about the days in the hospital, about the Christmas trees he had to buy alone, because Laura was too weak to leave the house, about the way Emma could not understand why her mother would not wake up. He said he had tried dating again, tried building something new for himself and his daughter, but every date felt like a courtroom where he was the defendant. "They look at me," he said, his hands clasped so tightly they had turned pale, "like I am a discounted item because I come with her. They never say it, but I know. I see it in their eyes. They want a man who is free, unburdened, someone with no responsibilities, not someone carrying a 7-year-old and the shadow of a wife who passed away." His voice trembled at the end, not from anger, but from the loneliness that had frozen inside him for too long. Grace did not interrupt, did not offer empty comfort. She only watched him as though she were holding every word, carefully afraid they might fall and shatter. Michael continued speaking of the nights he stayed awake, because storms frightened Emma, of how he had to learn to braid her hair every morning, of how he stood in front of the refrigerator, looking at the colourful drawings covering its doors, drawings in which Emma always placed Mummy in heaven at the centre, and how he felt like he would never be enough. "I am not good at this," he said, his vision blurring for a second. "I am just trying. But sometimes I think trying is not enough to make someone want to stay." Grace leaned slightly toward him, and what surprised Michael was not pity, but a depth of understanding that nearly took his breath away. "Michael," she said quietly, "you do not have to be good. You just have to be real. And you are real in a way most men never dare to be." Michael shook his head, attempting a smile, but it bent awkwardly, unable to hide the hurt. "What I have," he said, "is rarely what women want." Grace looked at him, the sharpness gone from her eyes, replaced by a rare gentleness. "So you are telling me that a man who loses sleep so his daughter will not be scared of storms, a man who learns to braid her hair so she can feel confident at school, a man who keeps his late wife's lotion because he doesn't have the strength to throw it away, is not good enough," Michael froze. No one had ever spoken about those things in a way that made them sound beautiful. No one had ever called those small efforts reasons to love him. Seeing he did not answer, Grace placed her hand on the table, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel she was there, and truly meant it. You were rejected, not because you are not good enough, she said. You were rejected because you are deep. And depth scares people who do not know how to love with their whole heart. Michael felt his breath catch. He looked down to hide the tremor in his eyes, but Grace saw anyway. She saw everything. Emma, she said softly, is the most beautiful part of your life. And any woman who does not see that does not deserve to enter your family. Michael lifted his gaze, startled by how precisely she seemed to understand him after only a few hours. Grace continued, her voice low and warm like a cello in a small room. And I, she whispered, I was rejected because I cannot have children. They looked at me like damaged goods, like I was incomplete. A sad smile touched her lips. So when I heard your story, I thought maybe these two broken pieces could make something together. Not perfect, but beautiful in its own way. Michael set his hand on the table, hesitating, then spoke so quietly, his words nearly disappeared into the clinking dishes around them. I thought I would be alone forever. Until tonight. Grace looked at him, and for the first time, her smile was not sad, not guarded, but truly bright, like the Minnesota lake catching sunlight after a snowstorm. Then let me ask again, she whispered. Will you give me a chance not to marry you, but to see if we can make something good? Michael drew a long breath, and for the first time in many years, felt his heart open, like an old door finally shifting on its hinges. And in the gentle hum of Christmas music, with snow clinging to the windows and the warm light of the diner surrounding them, he slowly nodded, not as an answer, but as an acknowledgement of something deeper. He was no longer afraid, because Grace had looked at him, and she had not turned away. When the server placed 2 steaming plates of pasta on the table, the warmth of rosemary and tomatoes drifted into the air, and Michael realized he had forgotten what hunger felt like. Something else was consuming him, far more intensely than the need to eat the presence of Grace Whitford, a woman he had known for less than 1 hour yet, who made him feel as though the two of them had stepped into a conversation, abandoned in a previous lifetime. They sat across from each other in the lakeside diner, a place so familiar to Michael he could close his eyes and still identify the sound of its jingling door whenever someone walked in. Yet tonight the space felt so strangely new it made him straighten his posture, breathe more quietly, and listen more closely. Grace turned her glass of red wine, gently, the warm yellow lights of the diner casting a soft glow on her skin, easing the sharpness carved into every line of her features. I worked 10, 12 sometimes, 15 hours a day for 10 years, she said, as the server walked away. I built my company from an old computer in my father's garage until the moment I signed my first contract. Back then, I never thought about family or children. I only thought about surviving in a tech industry full of people who wanted me gone. She paused and let out a soft laugh, a smile bending her lips like a secret she rarely shared. Then when the company grew to 200 employees and 3 offices, everyone told me I was too successful for men to feel comfortable. Can you believe that Michael looked at her surprised by how she spoke, not bragging, not complaining, but as though she were unlocking a door that had been bolted shut for years? I can, he said with a sincerity that made Grace pause for a moment. People do not always know how to face what does not make them feel bigger. Grace studied him for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if evaluating something inside him she could not yet identify. And you? She asked, tilting her head slightly. "You work at the lumber mill, right?" "Yes." Michael wiped his hands with a napkin. "I am not as successful as you. I just do what I need to do to raise Emma." Michael Grace said, her tone sharpening with conviction. Raising a child alone is a kind of success most men will never understand. The words hit him so unexpectedly, he almost swallowed wrong, as if a strand of pasta had caught in his throat. No one in the past 6 years had ever said that to him. All he had received were half-hearted sympathies, pitying looks, or forced blind dates suggested by well-meaning acquaintances. But Grace, she looked at him the way someone looks at a survivor, someone who carried their pain like a quiet victory. Something inside him eased a burden, long invisible, shifting slightly from his shoulders. "Emma loves to draw," he said, as though he instinctively sought a safer direction for the conversation. "My whole kitchen is covered in her drawings. I actually had to buy more magnets just to hold them all up." Grace smiled, and Michael swore that smile felt like Christmas lights flickering on in the dark. "You talk about your daughter as if every story is a piece that fills your heart," she said. "I like that." Michael felt his cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from the rare feeling of being understood so deeply it made him want to look away. "And she talks non-stop," he said with a small laugh, "especially when she asks about her mom." Grace set her fork down, her gaze softening. "What do you tell her?" Michael took a heavy breath. "I tell her Laura is somewhere no one hurts anymore. And I tell her I will try my best to find the right person to come into our lives." Grace blinked, and Michael knew those words had touched her more deeply than she intended to reveal. "Do you think that person exists?" she asked quietly. Michael considered it. "I used to think so," he admitted. "But all those dates made me feel like something people bid on. No one wants a widower with a child. No one wants someone who still has scars." Grace lifted one corner of her mouth. "That is because they are afraid of things that are real." "What about you?" Michael asked, suddenly his voice lower. "Are you afraid?" Grace set her wine glass down, her hands folding together. In that moment, she did not look like the strong, composed woman he had met earlier. She looked like someone who had fallen, who had hurt, and who was still trying to stand up. "Of course I am," she whispered. "I am afraid I will love a child I did not give birth to. Afraid I will love a man who still loves the woman he lost. Afraid your family will never accept me. Afraid I will fail again." Michael felt his heart tighten. He wanted to tell her she deserved love, that she was strong, that she was not meant to replace anyone, but the words dissolved in his throat. Then Grace spoke the sentence that left him frozen. "But the thing I fear most," she continued, her voice trembling, "is living this life alone." The words echoed in Michael's mind, like the wind moaning across the lake, not because they were desperate, but because they were painfully true and painfully familiar. In that moment, in the old diner with 2 plates of pasta cooling between them, 2 strangers suddenly felt like pieces that had been searching for each other through too many empty winters. Michael slowly extended his hand, not touching Grace's, but placing it close, like offering a lifeline to someone sinking. "You are not alone," he said softly, almost blending into the Christmas music. Grace looked at his hand, then into his eyes. For the first time, the invisible armor she wore cracked. Then she said slowly, "Would you be willing to try?" Michael inhaled deeply, then nodded. Not a nod to Grace, but a nod to himself, an acknowledgement that perhaps, after all these years, his heart was finally ready to let someone in. And that quiet Christmas dinner became the moment neither of them expected the beginning of a second chance at life. On the Saturday morning of the following week, when the sun still had not burned away the mist over the Minnesota lake, Michael Grant was already standing in the kitchen, fumbling with an old pan as he made the chocolate chip pancakes Emma loved most. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from nerves. Today, for the first time in many years, he was bringing a woman to meet his daughter. He tried to keep his face calm, but inside him was a whirlpool he couldn't control. What if Emma did not like Grace? What if Emma felt replaced? And worse, what if Grace saw the real life of the two of them and decided it was all too complicated? He flipped the pan too hard, and a pancake landed half on the stove, edge burnt on one side. Emma giggled at the table, her blue eyes sparkling like the lake on a sunny day. "Daddy!" She tilted her head, blonde hair falling into her eyes. "Are you making pancakes or committing a crime?" Michael laughed, the sound pushing back a little of his worry. "I'm experimenting with abstract art," he said, dropping the burnt pancake on his own plate and handing Emma the prettiest one. "Eat up. We're going to the park in a bit." Emma blinked with cat-like curiosity. "Is anyone coming with us?" The question froze Michael for a few seconds. He turned away to wash his hands so she would not see the unease in his eyes. "A friend of mine," he said. "Her name is Grace." "Grace." Emma repeated softly, the unfamiliar name turning like a puzzle in her mind. "Does she like ducks?" Michael looked up, staring at his daughter's earnest little face. "I don't know," he said, "but you can ask her." And at that moment, the doorbell rang. Without needing anyone to tell her, Emma bolted toward the door, while Michael took a deep breath, the way someone would before the most important interview of their life. When he opened the door, Grace stood there in a cream-colored sweater, her hair loose her face, no longer carrying the hard edge of their first meeting, but instead holding the gentle nervousness of someone aware she was stepping into sacred territory. Cold wind swept across the porch, carrying the scent of snow and the faint rustle of late-season leaves. "Hi, Michael," she said, her voice softer than usual. "And hello to you," she added, bending slightly toward Emma, who was staring up at her. For a few seconds, Emma said nothing, a very rare occurrence. Grace smiled and extended her hand gently without insisting. "I'm Grace." "You must be Emma, right?" Emma looked at the hand, then at Grace's face, as though deciding whether this woman was a threat to the world she shared with her father. Then suddenly she asked, "Do you like ducks?" Grace blinked, then laughed, a sound that curved her eyes into crescent moons. "I love ducks," she answered, "but I've never seen any that eat as fast as the ones at Lakeside." "Will you show me?" Emma turned to Michael, her face lit up like a lantern. "Daddy, she likes ducks, and just like that, no fuss, no awkwardness." Emma opened her heart to Grace so quickly, Michael nearly sagged with relief. At the park, the lake stretched beneath a thin sheet of ice, while the sun hovered low, coloring the bare trees in gold. Emma ran toward a cluster of waddling ducks, a bag of bread swinging wildly in her hand. Grace stood beside Michael, sometimes stepping closer to Emma, sometimes stepping back as though reminding herself that her presence was a privilege, not an entitlement. "She is adorable," Grace said, tucking her hands into her coat pockets, her breath a pale cloud. Michael nodded, eyes following his daughter. "Emma is my whole world." Grace looked at him with a warmth strong enough to soften the crisp winter air. I know. Emma ran back and handed Grace a small piece of bread. "Feed them with me," she squealed. Grace knelt to Emma's height without hesitation and tossed the bread onto the lake. A particularly plump duck lunged forward, sending Emma into a fit of laughter. "Oh my goodness." Grace gasped dramatically. "That duck eats like a champion. That's Fred," Emma announced proudly. "I named him." "Fred, huh? It suits him perfectly." Grace laughed. Michael stood behind them, his heart slowing into a gentle rhythm. He had never seen Emma bond with someone new this quickly, not since her mother. And Grace, she was not trying to be perfect, not putting on a show to win Emma. She was simply herself. And that authenticity drew Emma in as naturally as breathing. After feeding the ducks, Emma dragged Grace to the swings. "Push me," she demanded. Of course, Grace said, pushing with just the right strength and rhythm, as if she had done this thousands of times. Michael walked over, arms folded. "You're good at that," he teased. Grace shrugged her hair, blowing back. "I read instructions online before I came." Michael burst into genuine laughter, not the polite kind he used to hide discomfort. "You did that just to meet Emma?" "Of course," Grace said. "I didn't want to ruin our first meeting." "Higher! Higher!" Emma yelled from the swing. Grace pushed a little harder, then looked back at Michael, her eyes filled with a sincerity he could not deny. "I want her to like me," she said softly. "But more than that, I want her to feel safe." Those words made Michael's heart tighten, because they were the very words Laura used to say. Yet hearing them now from someone else didn't hurt. It brought hope. When they returned home, Emma ran upstairs to fetch her newest drawings, insisting she wanted to show them to Grace. Michael and Grace stood in the kitchen only a few feet apart, though the space between their hearts felt smaller than ever. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For trying." Grace looked at him, her grey eyes filled with an emotion she dared not name. "I'm not trying, Michael," she said softly. "I truly want to be here." When Emma came barreling down the stairs with an armful of colourful drawings, pulling Grace onto the living room floor to look at each one, Michael realised this was not just a meeting between a woman and his daughter. This was the beginning of a change, gentle but profound for his small family. When Grace praised Emma's drawing of a pizza-eating dragon, Emma giggled loudly and suddenly threw her arms around Grace as if they had known each other for years. The hug startled Grace for a second. Then her arms closed around the little girl so tenderly it made Michael's breath catch. And in that moment, he understood something that filled him with fear and hope all at once. Grace was no longer a stranger. She had taken a very small step, straight into the heart of his family. The weeks that followed passed like a slow-moving kind of magic, a quiet peace Michael Grant had never dared to hope for, yet one that settled into his life so naturally it kept him awake on certain nights, wondering if he was dreaming. Every Sunday morning, Emma's laughter mingled with Grace's in his small kitchen as the two battled to see who could whisk eggs faster. Every Saturday afternoon, the three of them wandered along the endless stretch of the lakeside trail in the cold wind. And on the rare evenings when Grace did not have to work, she stopped by Michael's house simply to watch Emma build puzzles or color, and sometimes to curl up together under a thick blanket to watch old movies. But alongside that, warmth was a quiet fear, subtle as a hairline crack beneath winter ice, invisible to the eye, yet able to shatter everything underneath. It crept slowly into the minds of both Michael and Grace. For Michael, it came in the most ordinary, unsuspecting moments, when he caught sight of Laura's old lotion bottle still sitting in the bathroom cabinet, when Emma proudly showed Grace a drawing of the three of them as a new family, and he stood there torn between joy and grief, or when he heard Emma shout Grace with such eager affection, it left him wondering if he was pushing his daughter into a change too quickly. Some nights he sat alone in the dim living room, the Christmas lights he had forgotten to take down, still blinking softly, even though the season had passed, and he stared at the empty chair where Laura once sat. His heart tightened in a way he thought he had grown used to, only to discover it still hurt as sharply as the first day. He whispered into the quiet, "Laura, am I doing the right thing?" and the question never received an answer. As for Grace, even though she acted calm and comfortable around the father and daughter, she carried her own fear buried deep, difficult to speak aloud. She feared she was stepping into a home filled with memories too powerful, a past love, too immense, a late wife, too perfect in the eyes of the man she was beginning to care for more than she wanted to admit. Each time she saw Laura's photo on the wall, the woman with gentle eyes and a warm smile, Grace felt a tightness inside her chest, a string drawn so taut it vibrated. She admired Laura, yet felt unsettled. "Am I breaking something sacred?" she asked herself, while rinsing glasses in the kitchen, hearing Michael and Emma's laughter spill from the living room. And for Grace, the deepest fear arrived on the calmest evening of all, when Emma fell asleep on her lap while they watched an animated movie. That feeling of belonging, of a child trusting her enough to lean on her softened Grace's heart until it ached. She wanted to hold the little girl close to freeze the moment, but the thought that followed tightened her throat. I am not her mother. Do I even have a right to be here? Some nights Grace lay in her spacious but silent apartment in Minneapolis, staring at the ceiling, unsure why the possibility of being loved made her tremble. Maybe because she was used to finding her own way out, stitching her wounds alone, standing up by herself. The idea that someone might see her as enough, might need her, might choose her, left her both elated and terrified. One Friday evening, as Michael washed dishes and Grace stood by the window watching a thin swirl of snow fall outside, she asked quietly, "Do you ever feel like you are not ready?" Michael froze, his shoulders tensing. The question pierced directly into the fear he had been avoiding. Every single day he admitted his voice, blending with the sound of running water. Grace turned toward him, her eyes holding a rare fragility for someone usually so strong. "And you do? You think I'm trying to replace Laura?" Michael jolted at the question, the glass in his hand nearly slipping into the sink. "No," he said immediately, though, his heartbeat quickened, as if afraid the word alone might not be enough to erase her worry. "Grace, you cannot replace Laura. No one can. But I also do not want you to try." Grace swallowed her voice, barely more than a breath. "I am not trying. But I am scared people will think I am." Michael understood instantly. The small lakeside community could be warm and charming, but whispers and sidelong glances lingered like frost on window panes. Someone would say he was moving too fast. Someone would accuse Grace of intruding. Someone would bring up Laura. "I am scared too," Michael confessed as he dried his hands and stepped closer to her. "I am scared I will hurt you. Scared I will give Emma hope, and then somehow disappoint her." Grace looked down at her shoes, her voice thin as a crack across ice. "And you are afraid of loving me, aren't you?" The question stunned Michael as if she had seen through every layer of protection he had built over 6 years. He did not answer right away, unsure whether to speak the truth or shield her from it. But Grace saw the answer in his eyes before he could form a word. "It is all right," she said with a small, fragile smile. "I am afraid of loving you too." Her smile was so delicate, it made Michael want to pull her into his arms and shield her from everything. But he did not. He only stepped closer, letting the space between them shift from a wall into an unspoken promise. The next week passed with warm mornings and contemplative nights. One afternoon, Emma came home with a drawing in her hand, depicting 3 figures, her in the middle, holding hands with Michael and Grace, a bright sun shining above them. "I drew our family," she announced proudly, her eyes gleaming. Michael's heart skipped a beat. Grace stood frozen for a moment. The drawing, simple and childlike, held every longing the 2 adults were too afraid to voice. Emma ran to Grace and held up the paper. "Do you like it?" Grace knelt down, touching the drawing with hands that trembled. "I love it." Yet inside, a painful question echoed. How long am I allowed to be here? Can I become someone this child trusts? Or will I fail again? Michael watched them, his heart tightening with love and fear. He wanted to hold on to that moment forever. But he knew all magic was fragile. In the gentle weeks that followed, as Emma's and Grace's laughter blended like colors that had never met, but suddenly fit as evenings passed under the Christmas tree, still half decorated from the previous month, as warmth seeped into the quiet corners of the house, all 3 of them felt something beginning to bloom, a new family, forming a new chance rising. But at the same time, fear grew in the shadows, because both Michael and Grace knew this. When the heart begins to hope, it also becomes more breakable than ever. And neither of them could know that the greatest test was already waiting just ahead. One small crack and everything they had tried to build could collapse in a single moment. The Lakeside Elementary Art Exhibition took place on a bitterly cold Friday afternoon, with wind sweeping off the Minnesota lake, carrying tiny flakes of snow that stung the skin like pinpricks. Michael Grant held Emma's hand as they stepped into the large gymnasium, where long rows of display boards were lined up, covered in the children's brightly colored artwork. Warm yellow lighting filled the room, creating a cozy contrast to the harsh winter outside. Grace walked beside them, her wool scarf wrapped around her neck. Her grey eyes shimmering with a nervous excitement she could not quite hide. This was her first time attending one of Emma's school events, and although she had survived countless tense meetings and multi-million-dollar contract signings, Grace's heart beat faster than usual, as if she were entering a territory far more important than any business deal she had ever negotiated. Emma tugged both of them toward her class's section, where her 3 drawings were neatly pinned up. The first was a scene of Lakeside Lake, with chubby ducks fighting over bread. The second showed a small house glowing with Christmas lights. But the third, the one that made Michael freeze in place, was a drawing of 3 people holding hands, a man, a woman with hair like Grace's, and a smiling blonde little girl. At the top, in wobbly childlike letters, Emma had written, "My new family." Michael's heart clenched, while Grace covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes widening with emotion, as though someone had just handed her a dream she had never dared to imagine. Emma Michael tried to speak, but his throat tightened under the weight of too many feelings. "You drew this beautifully, Grace," whispered her voice, trembling softly. Emma turned around, glowing with pride. "I drew you, Grace. Because I like you. And because you're part of my family too." Those innocent words hit Grace with the force of a warm tidal wave, beautiful and overwhelming enough to steal her breath. This was what she wanted, what she had longed for, a family, a child calling her home. But she never thought it would come to her. And she certainly never thought she would want it this badly. Grace knelt down and hugged Emma, tears falling into the little girl's coat. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. "I am just really touched." Behind them, Michael watched a feeling rising in him that was warm and painful at the same time, as if he were getting a glimpse of a future he desperately wanted, but was terrified he might not be brave enough to hold on to. He wanted to touch Grace's shoulder, wanted to tell her he felt the same, that he wanted this too, that each day he was falling for her more deeply than he ever expected. But before he could move, a familiar voice spoke from behind. "Michael." He turned, and his stomach dropped. It was Diane Harper, Laura's closest friend, the woman who had always treated Emma like her own niece, and who firmly believed Michael should remain loyal to his wife's memory. Diane stood a few steps away, her eyes flicking from the drawing to Grace, and finally landing on Michael, filled with open disapproval. She made no attempt to hide. "I did not know you were dating," she said, her tone icy. It has not been that long, and already she stopped, forcing a thin smile sharp as a blade. Replacing Laura this quickly, the sound hit like shattering glass. Grace rose immediately, instinctively stepping back, half a pace, like someone caught somewhere they did not belong. Emma looked between them, confused. "It is not what you think, Diane," Michael said, trying to keep his voice even. "Grace isn't what Diane cut in. Isn't the new woman you are using to fill the hole Laura left. Isn't someone you are bringing into Emma's life before she even understands the hurt she carries." Each word became a needle driven straight into Grace's chest. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "Diane, that is enough," Michael said sharply, but he felt the entire room turning toward them, the weight of curious, pitying, judgmental eyes crashing over him like a wave. Diane pointed at the drawing. What does Emma call her? Her new mom. Michael's face drained of color while Grace's hands tightened until her knuckles turned white. "No," Michael said quickly. "It is not like that." Diane crossed her arms, eyes blazing. "Laura has been gone for 6 years. 6 years, Michael." "You forgot her that fast." The words punched him so hard, he staggered back half a step. The guilt he had tried so hard to silence surged up, consuming every bit of clarity he had. And in that moment, he made the worst mistake of his life. "Grace is just a friend," he blurted out, his voice shaky but unmistakably clear. "She is just helping out." The sentence tore through the air like a blade. Grace jolted as though someone had struck her. She stared at Michael, her grey eyes wide, disbelief flooding through them. "Just a friend," she repeated, her voice cracking. Michael Diane gave a cold, satisfied smile. "Good, because no one can replace Laura." Emma ran to Grace, grabbing her hand anxiously. "Grace, are you okay?" Grace bent down and kissed Emma's forehead, the kiss trembling like a farewell. Then she stood, tears gathering along her lashes. She looked straight at Michael. "I thought I understood you," she whispered. "But I guess I was wrong." Michael reached out a hand. Grace wait, but she stepped back, her shoulders shaking. "I am not a replacement, and I will not be someone you deny in front of everyone just to protect some perfect image of your past." She turned away. Emma held on to her. "Where are you going? You do not want to see the rest of my drawings." Grace knelt one more time, her tears falling into Emma's hair. "I love your drawings," she whispered, "but I have to go." When Grace walked out of the exhibition hall, Michael felt as though someone had reached into his chest and crushed his heart. Diane said something else, but he could no longer hear a word. All the noise in the room faded into the background, leaving only the sound of Grace's footsteps growing farther and farther away, carrying with them all the hope he had destroyed with a single sentence. Emma tugged his sleeve wide-eyed. "Daddy, did I do something wrong?" Michael knelt and held her tightly, but his eyes stayed locked on the doors Grace had disappeared through. He knew Emma was not wrong. Grace was not wrong. The only one who was wrong was him for letting fear and guilt and the ghost of the past crush the future he should have been brave enough to choose. And in that moment, Michael knew he had ruined the most beautiful thing that had come into his life since the day Laura died. Grace had walked into that exhibition like a light, and in one moment of weakness, he had extinguished it with his own hands. When the exhibition hall door closed behind Grace's footsteps, Michael Grant stood frozen, as if the entire world had shrunk into a cold, hollow space inside his chest. Every sound in the room, parents chatting, children laughing, Diane's heels clicking sharply on the floor, blurred into the distance as though sinking beneath a frozen lake. Emma clung to his sleeve, her small face scrunched in confusion. "Daddy, why was Grace sad?" "I do not understand." Michael had to swallow hard, struggling to gather enough breath to answer. But even the simplest, comforting words refused to pass through the tight knot in his throat. He only shook his head gently, smoothing Emma's hair, feeling more like a failure than ever. A failure to Grace, to Emma, and to the braver version of himself he thought he had begun to become. That night, the Grant house fell into silence. There was no bright laughter from Emma telling stories about ducks, no message from Grace at 9 o'clock like every day, no soft warmth drifting from the kitchen the way it always did when she visited. Michael sat at the dining table, staring at the chair Grace once occupied, the same chair Emma had innocently dragged closer to herself just 1 week earlier. Now it stood empty, abandoned, a painful reminder of what he had thrown away with his own hands. 3 days passed without a single message from Grace. Michael opened his phone again and again, only to see a blank screen with no new notifications. Guilt clung to him like frost on a window pane. He remembered every detail, the tremble in Grace's voice when she said, "I thought I understood you," the look in her eyes when he called her just a friend, the way her hands shook when Emma hugged her for the last time. Each memory cut into him like a dull blade, not deep enough to end the pain, but sharp enough to make him hurt with every breath. Emma felt the shift too, even though she was only 7 years old. Dinner time, once filled with chatter and giggles, became so quiet Michael could hear the ticking of the clock marking each slow minute. One night, Emma sat in the corner of the living room clutching her worn teddy bear. "Daddy," she whispered, "is Grace mad at me?" Because I called her, my new mum, Michael's heart twisted violently. He knelt down and pulled her into his arms. "No, sweetheart, you did nothing wrong. Grace is not mad at you." "Then where did she go?" Emma asked, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I miss her." The simple, honest sentence hit Michael harder than any accusation ever could. He turned his face away for a moment so Emma would not see the redness in his eyes. "I miss her too," he admitted, voice strained. But Emma did not need to know that he was the reason Grace had walked away. She did not need to know that Diane's sharp words still echoed inside his mind, the same words he had allowed to control him, pushing Grace toward the exit while he stood paralyzed. On the fourth day, Michael found a small pink note taped to Emma's bedroom door. In crooked, adorable handwriting, it said, "I want Grace to be my new mum." Just 7 simple words, but they crushed him in a way no reprimand ever had. He slid down to the floor, leaning back against the wall, the paper trembling in his hand. A deep ache rose in his chest, not because Emma wished for that, but because he had pushed away the one woman who might have truly become what Emma longed for. He thought of Laura, her gentle laughter in their happiest days, the pride in her eyes whenever Emma ran to him for a hug, and he wondered what Laura would say now. Would she accuse him of betrayal, or would she tell him he deserved to love again? The answer came not as words, but as a feeling, a distant ache shaped like memory. Laura had always wanted him to be happy. She had always wanted Emma to have a full family. She had always wanted the people she loved to live fully, not become ghosts trapped in their own past. Michael buried his face in his hands. "I am sorry, Laura," he whispered. "I am sorry I let fear blind me, and sorry I hurt someone who did not deserve it." On the 5th day, Michael could not take it anymore. He drove to Minneapolis and stood in front of Grace's apartment building, unable to press the call button. He stood there for more than 10 minutes, his hand trembling. He was afraid to face her, afraid to see disappointment in her eyes, afraid she would tell him she had decided to walk away from him and Emma forever. When he finally drove back home without seeing her, the regret hit him even harder. On the 6th day, Emma packed up her toys in her room and asked, "If I write Grace a letter, will she come back?" Michael bit his lip. "She needs time, sweetheart." Emma nodded, though she did not understand what that meant. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Michael sat on the sofa, staring at the pink note lying on the table. He looked at it for hours, as if staring long enough could undo everything he had broken. But life was not that simple. He had to act. He had to fight for what mattered, something he should have done at the exhibition. He had to try to fix what he had ruined, even if there was no guarantee he still had a chance. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, Michael made his decision. He stood up, grabbed his coat, took Emma's pink note, and knew that tomorrow, despite the fear crushing his chest, he would go find Grace. He would tell her everything, and if she pushed him away, he would accept it. But if there was even a 1% chance she might come back, he would use every breath he had to hold on to it. Because for the first time in many years, Michael knew exactly what he wanted. He did not want a perfect memory. He did not want to carry grief like a relic. He wanted the future. He wanted Grace. He wanted a family. And he swore that this time he would not let fear destroy the best thing that had happened to him ever again. At 6 o'clock the next evening, as Minnesota snow fell in thick layers that seemed determined to swallow the entire city, Michael Grant stood before the tall apartment building where Grace Whitford lived. The cold wind whipped against his face, stinging until his lips cracked, but nothing made him turn back. In his coat pocket, Emma's pink note sat clenched in his hand like a talisman. He looked up at the 3rd-floor window, where a faint, warm light glowed, and his heart pounded hard enough to push him forward. Finally, he pressed the doorbell. A long silence followed, as if time itself was testing his resolve. Then Grace's voice came through the intercom, rough and tired. "Who is it? It is me. Michael." He heard a sharp inhale, then quiet. "Grace, please. Just 5 minutes." The door buzzed open. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, each step heavy, as though carrying months of regret. When the door opened, Grace stood there, wearing a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, her eyes red and swollen. There was no icy confidence, no composed strength, only hurt she had tried to hide but could not. "What do you want, Michael?" she asked, her voice no longer sharp, but exhausted. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, yet keeping distance, afraid of wounding her again. "Grace, I am sorry." She folded her arms tightly across her chest, a barrier she needed to shield her bruised heart. "What are you sorry for? For calling me a friend? For denying everything in front of people? Or for making me feel like I was nothing more than a temporary support beam?" Michael shook his head, eyes reddening. "No, it is not like that. I was scared." Grace let out a short, bitter laugh. "We are all scared, but not everyone uses fear as an excuse to stab someone else." Michael did not argue. She was right. When Diane said those things, I felt myself being dragged back to the day Laura died. That memory is still too huge. I was afraid that if I admitted how I felt about you, people would think I was betraying Laura. And I was afraid I was not good enough for you or Emma. Grace lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. "Michael, what do you think I need? A perfect man. I chose you because you are real. Because you are an incredible father. Because you made me believe I could belong somewhere." "You do belong," Michael said, quickly, his voice cracking. "I was wrong not to say that in front of everyone. I was wrong to let Diane scare me. But it is not that I didn't want you. It is that I wanted you too much." Grace lifted her gaze, her grey eyes shimmering, no longer angry, only hurt. "Then why did you push me away? Because I thought I was protecting you." Michael answered his hand, tightening around the pink note. "But instead, I only hurt you." He held the note out. Grace looked at it, and as soon as she read the wobbly words, "I want Grace to be my new mum," her lips trembled. "Emma wrote this for me. She misses you," Michael said, his voice splintering. "I do too." Grace covered her mouth as tears spilled out. "Michael, I do not want to replace Laura. I never wanted that. I know," he said, stepping closer, his voice steady and low. "I do not want you to replace anyone. I want you to be Grace. The woman who made me laugh again after so many years. The woman Emma trusted the very first time she met you. The woman he faltered for just a moment. "The woman I love." Grace froze, as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. "You love me?" Michael nodded, eyes unwavering. "I have loved you longer than I realized, and I will regret it for the rest of my life if I do not say it right now." A choked sound escaped Grace's throat. She stepped back, not from fear, but because her heart was trying to make sense of the words she had been longing to hear for weeks. Michael extended his hand, not demanding, simply offering. "Grace, I cannot promise perfection. I cannot promise I will never make mistakes again. But I can promise I will fight for us. For you. For Emma." Tears dripped onto the wooden floor. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then she stepped forward into his arms. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her voice trembling like a candle flame in the wind. "I have been waiting for those words more than you know." Michael held her tightly, as if letting go would allow the icy wind outside to steal her away. In that moment, the snow continued falling. The city remained wrapped in frozen silence, but where they stood was warm enough to melt everything else. And Michael knew he had just walked through the greatest fear of his life. For the first time in many years, the future no longer terrified him. It filled him with hope. 20 minutes later, Michael and Grace stood in front of Lakeside Diner, the place where everything between them had begun, the place where fate had whispered a question that sent two lonely lives colliding. Snow blanketed the steps, and the warm yellow light spilling from the windows seemed to invite them back in to continue the story they had nearly lost. When Michael pushed the door open, the familiar jingle sounded, and he felt as though he were stepping into a memory, only this time he was not trembling with shame or emptiness. This time he walked in beside the woman he had chosen. Grace looked around and quickly recognized the table by the window, the one where she had once asked the wildest question of her life. She smiled softly, a smile carrying a touch of embarrassment and a warm note of nostalgia. "You brought me here to remind me of the moment I completely lost my mind, didn't you?" Michael shook his head gently. "No. I brought you here because it is the place where you saved me from myself." They sat down at the same table. Grace placed her hand on the wooden surface, as if listening for echoes of the past in each grain. At that moment, she said quietly, "I did not understand why I dared to ask you for that question. But now, thinking back, maybe my heart had chosen you before my mind had the chance to object." Michael smiled and took her hand on the table. "I wish I had been as brave as you." Grace shook her head. "Bravery is not the absence of fear, Michael. Bravery is moving forward, even when your heart is trembling." The familiar server walked by, recognizing them but saying nothing, only offering a warm smile as if he had witnessed their entire journey from the beginning. Michael took a breath, then spoke slowly. "I know I was wrong, and I know I hurt you, but I will never let that happen again." Grace looked at him for a long, quiet moment, before a gentle smile spread across her face. "I do not need you to be perfect. I just need you to be honest." The words made Michael want to pull her into his arms, but instead he squeezed her hand tighter, a promise without needing any elaborate speech. Then the diner door opened again, and Emma walked in with Michael's sister. When she saw Grace, she paused for a heartbeat, then her eyes lit up, like Christmas lights flickering on in a dark room. "Grace?" Emma ran forward and threw her arms around her, holding her as if afraid she might disappear again. Grace hugged her back, tears shining but full of joy. "I missed you," she whispered, her voice trembling with affection. "I missed you too," Emma replied, climbing onto Grace's lap as naturally as if she had done it for years. Michael watched them, feeling something inside him, a hollow that had once seemed impossible to fill, now warm and soft and healing. And in that moment, Emma lifted her head, her expression suddenly serious, though her voice was small and fragile, as if she feared breaking something sacred. "Grace, can you be my new mum?" The words were gentle as breath, yet rang like a bell through the hearts of the two adults. Grace pressed a hand over her mouth as tears spilled freely. Michael looked at her without pressing, without demanding, simply waiting for the answer his heart already knew. Grace pulled Emma into her arms, hugging her tightly, as if trying to pour all her warmth into the little girl. "I have been waiting for you to ask me that," she whispered, voice hoarse. "If you want, I will be your new mum." Emma squealed with delight and wrapped her arms around Grace's neck, laughing like a little angel on a holiday morning. Michael stood and joined them, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder, his eyes filled with a love he no longer hid. "Grace," he said, "I am not rushing. I am not asking you to marry me today, but I want you to know you are our family. Not temporarily. Not because someone is missing, but because you are you. Grace lifted her gaze to him, her grey eyes shimmering in the warm light. "I want that," she said. "I want to stay." And as the three of them embraced, snow continued to fall outside, but inside them, winter had ended. A new family was born, not from perfection, but from choice, from courage, from scars, no longer hidden from love, arriving at the moment it was finally allowed in. And if the story of Michael, Grace, and Emma touches your heart, share it so someone out there might find their own hope. Leave a small comment to remind everyone that love always deserves a second chance. From the perspective of a human behavior expert, the story of Michael, Grace, and Emma reveals a profound truth. People are not healed by time, but by the presence of those who are patient enough to step into their wounded places. Michael learns to face his loss instead of running from it. Grace learns to believe she is worthy of love even without perfection, and Emma, with the purity of a child's heart, becomes the bridge that helps two adults rediscover their faith in family. The strongest families are not the perfect ones, but the ones built on choice, courage, and kindness. If this journey toward rediscovered happiness touches you, please like and subscribe so we can continue sharing stories filled with hope and humanity. And leave a comment with the phrase, "New Family," to remind us all that everyone deserves a second chance.